This section starts with ancient Israel, and we're going to talk about the importance of the idea of monotheism, as well as the role that the early Jewish tradition had on Western civilization up till today. At the end of the day, what we're talking about here is monotheism. And this particular branch of monotheism that ends up in ancient Israel traces itself back to a man named Abraham and specifically his descendants, Isaac and Jacob. Now, that having been said, it's important to note here that we're not making a judgment, rather, about the historical accuracy or the historical reality of the biblical account. For the purposes of what we're doing here, the historical reality of the Bible is not important, because we're not making that argument. What we're trying to do, what I'm expecting you to think about, is the fact that these people, these historical people, believed these things, and because they believed these things, it had a certain influence and impact on the way the world worked and how they looked at the world, and it flows all the way down to us. So don't get hung up in arguing over the historical reality of the Bible, because there's no way you can ever win that argument one way or the other, depending on your point of view. What you need to think about is the fact that for whatever reason in this time period, this man and the folks that are all around him decide to completely ditch polytheism, polytheism being the religion which has a huge pantheon of gods that we talked about earlier, for monotheism. And of course, monotheism is all about a relationship with the one God, a God, single. And the way this entire thing works is these people make a pact, a covenant with God. And you've got to imagine for just a second, you've got these almost semi-nomadic people that are living in these little border regions. They're not quite Mesopotamia, they're not quite Egypt. In fact, if you look at a map, the area that we're talking about is kind of the extreme western border of the Mediterranean, and it's quite literally right in between Egypt and Mesopotamia, what would be modern-day Iraq. But they make this covenant with God, and they abandon polytheism. So polytheism is, of course, this idea that you have many, many, many gods, and each god has a certain aspect or feeling or something that is tied specifically to it. And in this new version that these tribal people come up with, they hitch their wagon to this one God. And the deal that they make, and that's essentially what this covenant is that God would stick up for them if they gave up all of their other gods and put none before him. Quite literally, they're commanded by this covenant to have no other gods before me. And this is it's a special relationship these people have with their deity. They call themselves the chosen people, and this relationship is tested over and over and over again. Eventually, there's a period of exile in here, which we'll talk about later, but eventually their God gives them what is the Ten Commandments, and we should all be fairly familiar with that. I'm sure you've heard that before. And it reinforces this idea of the one deity and the person having a relationship with the divine. This is the name of their God. I called him Yahweh, and what I've written on the slide here is the name of the God spelled out in Hebrew. Hebrew is an extremely complicated and dense language. You have more information coming from the divine straight to people. So not only do you have monotheism, but it's a specific type. It's called ethical monotheism. And the idea here is that God is the source of ethical principles. Now, whatever they may be, these ethical ideas are coming from the divine. Now, keep this in contrast in your mind with that brief monotheism that we talked about in Egypt under the pharaoh Akhenaten. So, Akhenaten is giving rules and making decisions, and he's providing an extra layer of, for lack of a better term, bureaucracy between people and God. In his case, it was the Son. In this case, it was Yahweh. But Akhenaten is distilling this information out to people, whereas with ethical monotheism, this information is codified. And in the Ten Commandments, it's supposedly, quite literally carved into a stone that they can reference, and it gives these people an outline written down of how to run their daily affairs, how to live their lives, really basic ideas about the world around them and how they should interact with each other and what they should and shouldn't do. In addition, they have judges in their society to help them along, and it doesn't always work the way that they intended, but I think that probably has more to do with human nature than with any specific weakness with ethical monotheism as a religion. Many years after the initial development of ethical monotheism between the Israelites, you see this man, David, become king and basically expand all throughout this area of the Levant, this area of what the Western Mediterranean that we've been talking about, and bring it all under one rulership. It just occurred to me, I said many years later, specifically I said that on purpose. So you'll notice that I don't give you a lot of very specific dates. Number one, in this time period, the dates are kind of loosey-goosey anyway. But number two, learning about history is not about memorizing dates. You can always go to a book somewhere and look up the specific date of something. It's more about understanding and asking important questions about the relationships between things. How did one thing lead to another? Why did people live their lives this way? And questions like that. So don't be dismayed as you go through this, and I'm not giving you exact numbers. I mean, you've been trained by high school history classes to just memorize the dates, and that's just boring. Nobody wants to do that. I don't want to do that, and I love history. So when there is an important date, I will absolutely make sure to point out that this is a date you will absolutely need to know. But I'm more interested in you understanding how all of the pieces of the puzzle fit together and how they influence each other than just memorizing dates. Okay, off my soapbox. So David unites all of these tribal elements into one kingdom. This, of course, greatly increases the power of the monarchy, and he makes his capital a place called Jerusalem. And when he does this, he kind of locks Jerusalem into the cultural memory as this religious center point. And Jerusalem becomes an extremely powerful center, not just for religion, but also for military purposes and politics as well. You can see on the map here the outline of what is modern-day Israel. That's essentially overlaid with the kind of peach-colored map outline that is the extent of David's kingdom. And you have a listing of some of the other surrounding kingdoms in that second map on that side. It's really no small feat that this political unit, has come together. If you think about how small this geographic area is versus how large Egypt is and how large Mesopotamia is, it's pretty impressive when you've got such powerful political neighbors, such powerful militaries right next door, that this is able to hold itself together for as long as it does. The successor to David is Solomon. King Solomon finishes the temple in Jerusalem, and this temple then becomes the center for Yahweh worship. It also becomes a symbol, a very powerful symbol, of the power of the Israelite monarchy. At the temple, there was an extremely complicated system of ritual sacrifice, and this is presided over by an elite priesthood. And if you look at this illustration, you can see the basic layout and proportions of the temple. And we have pretty good specifications for the construction of the temple, and you can actually find these in 1st and 2nd Chronicles in the Bible. What happens here is the construction of this temple and opening it for worship brings a laser beam like focus to Yahweh worship. It becomes the almost like a rallying point around which people gather for all manner of different reasons, not just religious but also political and military. Following the reign of King Solomon, the monarchy breaks up, and what you end up with are two different kingdoms. The one in the north is called Israel, and the one in the south is called Judah. Judah has the city of Jerusalem in it, and the people in Jerusalem continue to work on refining their version of monotheism. There's lots of instructional text written at this time, and they pursue it as if it is well, it is part of a major part of their society. Israel, however, is plagued by all manner of violent and reoccurring social and political issues, and this leaves them weakened, and they're in a really bad neighborhood to be weak because they're surrounded by all manner of aggressive military powers, especially the Assyrians in the north. As a consequence, Israel is conquered by the Assyrians in 722 BC. Don't worry about that date. Now, the Assyrians had a policy of forced relocation when they conquered a people or a territory. This is one way that the Assyrians preserved and promoted their own power. So the nation of Judah survives, and their continued to fixation with religion as such a strong component of their society, combined with the fact that they're a much smaller land area, allows them to defend themselves. And they're also a little bit more aggressive in their defense than Israel was, and this works out for them for a little while. And I say a little while because shortly thereafter, or relatively shortly thereafter, the Babylonians then conquer Judah. And in doing so, they destroy the temple, and also, like the Assyrians before them, they drag all the Israelites into captivity. And the ruler of Babylon, hence the Babylonians at that time, was a man named Nebuchadnezzar. And the name for this time period, and certainly the Israelites generally understood it as this, but they called this time under the control of the Babylonians the Babylonian exile. This is not Exodus. That is something else entirely, and more mythic than the Babylonian exile. But these people that are taken into captivity, their monotheism gives them the ability to focus upon something. It allows 12,000 some odd Israelites to survive as an entity, as a religion, as a culture, and as a people, despite the fact that they're being surrounded, well, number one, that they're being exiled, and then they're surrounded by all of these different odd cultures all around them. And this is extremely significant. So despite massive geographic dislocation, these people are able to hold on to their religion and faith very well. And they go on to build their own places of worship, and they call these synagogues. Now, these are non-traditional places of assembly. They're not straight reproductions of the temple that was in Jerusalem. They're much more functional than that. But they are carrying their religion with them instead of just adopting the religion of wherever it is that they seem to be deposited. Now, when you have something like a synagogue, it will further reinforce the idea of this separate identity. You have a special destiny, and you have a special place in the world, and this goes back to the idea of the relationship that the Israelites had made with Yahweh. So their religion is working out very well for them because it's keeping them as a unit. It's helping with social cohesion. And this particular picture is the Kfar Bar Aram synagogue. It's one of the oldest synagogues in the world. It's a little bit ironic. there's a running theme in this time period that one after another, whole civilizations are cast down and destroyed or conquered by other ones, and the same exact thing happens to the Babylonians. They do not last themselves. They're destroyed by the Persians. Persia is under control of a man named Cyrus the Great, and Cyrus himself is at the head of a huge dynasty of kings, and he permits the Israelites to return to the Levant, what would become the modern state of Israel. And once they're back in this ancestral land, the Israelites are free again to worship as they please. In 538 BC, the construction of a second temple begins, and the second temple is much larger and more complicated than the first. It is definitely monumental in scale. It's got a large system of courts and gates and walls, and the temple rapidly reassumes this central place for worship again, with the corresponding social effects that just as happened before. It becomes a central location for all manner of draws all manner of social attention to it. And it is in this time period between about 538 to 70 BC that the idea of being Jewish, or calling yourself becoming a Jew, or using that as a phrase, begins to actually take meaning. And there are upsides and downsides to the idea of beginning to have an identity and self-identifying yourself with a specific place on earth and a specific set of cultural traits. And this manifests itself during the First Jewish-Roman War. So the Jewish state falls under domination of Rome and is made an official province. And part of what happens when you become a province of Rome is that you are now required to pay taxes. And you'll remember this whole render unto Caesar thing out of the Bible. This is kind of the same idea. But there are several groups of Jews in this area that resent the Romans and begin to agitate for the Romans to be thrown out, and for them to be left to their own devices and in control of their own land. One group are called the Zealots, and the other are called the Sciari. And the Sicarii are extremely violent. They use assassination techniques to kill anyone who doesn't agree with their program, whether it be Roman or other Jews. And of course, obviously, Rome is completely disinterested in all of the cultural distinctness of the Jews, and they treat it just as a simple revolt. And the response to this is that Emperor Titus sends in the legions to deal with all of these rebellious factions. And the second temple was still standing right up until Rome entered Jerusalem in 70 AD. And when the legions come in and put down the rebels they were basically occupying the city, they also destroyed the temple. And you can see on the left-hand side, right where the arrow is, some Roman soldiers carrying away some of the gold ornaments from inside of the temple. And 70 AD is a pretty important date for you to know, because this temple is destroyed, and the ramifications that it has for not just Judaism but two other religions as well. And in this photograph, this is the site. Today you can see just piles of stones that are still left over, and this is where the Romans literally tore down the walls stone by stone, looking for gold. Now, this war ends after the destruction of the temple with the complete extermination of the last remnants of these kind of rebellious factions at the fortress of Masada. And if you look at the photograph, there's a ramp that comes up from the valley to the top of the summit of the mountain, right underneath where the arrow is, and that was the causeway built by the Romans, and they literally just battered down the wall and then went in there and killed everybody, hence reasserting Roman control and ending the war. And many years later, this is during the time of during the time of the expansion of Islam. So we're talking the probably about 630, maybe 638 AD. Caliph Abdul Malik builds a mosque on the site of the temple. It's been destroyed and hadn't been rebuilt after the First Jewish-Roman War. And the site of the mosque actually shares part of the footprint of the second temple, and you can see that in the photograph right underneath the red arrow, the red box being the temple and then the black box being the mosque. And what this does is instantly transforms this mosque into a source of constant irritation for Jews that believe that this is set aside for them by divine right. And be very, very clear, this city in general is also a sacred site for Christians. After the founding of Christianity, and then later after the building of the Dome of the Rock, the site becomes a pilgrimage site for all three major religions. And this has historically generated tremendous amounts of conflict. There's been tremendous amount of bloodshed between all three of these religions, and this goes on to this very day. And because of the central location of the temple here and the importance it has for all three of these religions, this is something that we are unfortunately still dealing with to this very day. The recent State Department recognition of Jerusalem as the capital of Israel generated lots and lots of protest, riots. People have been shot, just about everything short of all-out war. So this is something also we're going to be dealing with for as long as the city is around and for as long as these three religions are around. The only part of the second temple still left, other than the piles of rubble here and there, is the western wall. And architecturally speaking, it is a simple retaining wall designed to hold the top deck of the mountain back. But religiously speaking, it is an incredibly sacred space. And people use it for reflection, for prayer, and as a destination for pilgrimage. We have to shift gears just a little bit, backtrack just a little bit, and talk about the Persians. In the 500 BC, Cyrus the Great, conquers what's left of the Babylonian Empire. And he pushes out the frontiers of the Persian Empire to a great extent. And you can see that here on this map. So essentially, the Persians have an empire that literally stretches across what was then basically the known world. It would be from modern day, what is modern day Greece, all the way to India. And they remain the dominant power at more or less this size, with the exclusion of Cyrus's son, named Cambyses, and he extends the empire further into Egypt and Libya as well. It is in the campaign to conquer Egypt that Cambyses earns a unique nickname. They began to call him Cambyses the Cat Thrower, and this is because he started to use a sacred animal to disrupt his enemy. And this may sound very weird, but you have to remember that hardly anyone in this entire part of the world that we've been talking about is monotheistic. And at this time, Egypt is still full of all manner of gods, and most of the Egyptian gods looked or had animal features, and there were plenty of them that had the features of cats. And so this became a valid military tactic in order to confuse and distract the enemy. Darius succeeds Cambyses, and Darius establishes what is essentially a series of administrative groups called satraps, and they're under remote control from the Persian capital, but the idea is the satraps can administer to the empire, because you've got such a huge land area that is controlled by the Persians. They have to break it up into these smaller units just to be able to control everything. Think about it in a really rough way, and I'm not saying it's exactly the same way that states in the United States have capitals, and then there's also the capital of the United States. So the idea being that state capitals can exert local control, and then you also have the capital and the military power. Darius does attempt to conquer Greece, but he fails to complete that conquest, and Xerxes takes up the challenge. Now Xerxes does take Anatolia. Anatolia is basically Turkey the coast of Turkey, what would be the modern country of Turkey, not the sandwich meat. And but again, Xerxes fails to take mainland Greece, and part of this is very irksome to Xerxes. He embarks upon this campaign to make himself out as this divine king, calls himself the King of Kings, and he fights Greece for just about half of forever, with mixed results over time. But his focus is on the majesty of his office, not on necessarily the administration of the empire. And one of the central religions that was practiced by the Persians is what's called Zoroastrianism. And this is a prophetic religion. It has a strange history of cross-contamination in terms of orthodoxy. And what that means is you can actually see features of other religions popping up in Zoroastrianism, and you can see ideas that came from Zoroastrianism popping up in places like Judaism. There's a focus on purity. There's a focus on the idea of a supreme creator being. In Zoroastrianism, it happened to be a being called Ahura Mazda. It's an internal ethical religion, and it emphasized good and evil. And the children of Ahura Mazda were reflections of one was good and one was evil. And you can see a lot of similarities in this clear distinction between good and evil, internal ethical religion with Judaism. And some of the ideas show up again and again, as if these stories and if these religions are borrowing from each other. Earlier, you see a flood story in the Epic of Gilgamesh, and in Zoroastrianism, there's a strong idea of the final judgment, and you see that picked up, or not picked up, but you see that also demonstrated very strongly in Christianity. In fact, it's one of the central tenets.